a task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Content warning. The report contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. The report contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence. U.S. Civil War and the End of Enslavement. Political struggles leading up to the U.S. Civil War between 1850 and the start of the Civil War in 1861, the political fight over enslavement's westward expansion and African Americans' legal rights became more intense and more violent. Politicians in Congress pushed through the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, a law that overturned the 1820 Missouri Compromise that had outlawed enslavement in most of the Louisiana Purchase lands. 458 This meant that white settlers in the new western territories of Kansas and Nebraska territories could allow enslavement if they wanted to do so. Civil war broke out in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers who had rushed there to claim the new territory for their side. 459 The Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas, as this violence came to be called, shocked many Northerners who opposed enslavement moving into the West. They formed a new political party, the Republican Party, which was based mostly in the North and whose main goal was stopping the westward expansion of enslavement. 60. Southerners became more anti-slavery. Pro-slavery Southerners became even louder in their defense of enslavement. 461 They falsely claimed that enslavement gentle and humane institution, and that enslaved people got just as many benefits from the institution as white people because they received lifelong care and support in exchange for their work. 62 Pro-slavery people also used scientific racism, the false theory that all white people were naturally smarter and more civilized than African-descended people, to argue that enslavement was good for people of African descent because it uplifted them. 63. 1850s, the U.S. Supreme Court supported these false theories that African Americans were inferior to white Americans and helped open the western U.S. to enslavement. 1857 Case of Dred Scott versus Sanford, the court decided that African Americans were not citizens of the United States and did not have any of the legal rights that white Americans had. 464 Chief Justice Roger Taney, from the enslaving state of Maryland, explained that white people had always treated black people as slaves and that African Americans were so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. 65 In addition to denying African Americans claims to legal rights, the court also said that the federal government had no power to close enslavement out of the western territories. 66 The U.S. California tried to pass a black exclusion law at least 4 times during the 1850s. 4. Chapter 2. Enslavement. The Constitution allowed slaveholding Southerners to take their property, including property in human beings, into the western territories. 67. Free African Americans resisted their legal exclusion from U.S. citizenship both before and after the Dred Scott decision by claiming birthright citizenship. This was the idea that birth on U.S. automatically made them citizens of the United States. 468 Across the first half of the 1800s, African Americans used local courthouses and everyday interactions with state and municipal governments to establish that their U.S. entitled them to the title and rights of citizenship. 169 The groundwork laid by free African Americans was eventually the foundation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which made everyone born in the United States a citizen of the United States. 470. Conflict over enslavement's westward expansion and African Americans' rights broke out into a full civil war in 1861. Lincoln, a Republican, won the presidential election of 1860 by promising to keep enslavement from moving west into any new territories. 471 Pro-slavery Southerners claimed Lincoln's election was proof that all Northerners wanted to end enslavement, give citizenship rights to African Americans, and cause a race war in the South. 472. 2 months after Lincoln's election, South Carolina, an enslaving state, voted to leave the United States. 473 Over the next 2 months, an additional 6 enslaving states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas also left the United States. The Confederate States of America, also known as the Confederacy. Once war broke out in 1861, another 4 enslaving states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, joined the Confederacy. 474 The deadliest war in U.S. history had begun. Civil War, and the Emancipation Proclamation. Confederate States of America, also known as the Confederacy, fought to create a new nation built on the enslavement of people of African descent. The Confederate Constitution was based strongly on the U.S. Constitution, except that it outlawed the national government from ending enslavement 475, and it said that white people living in any new Confederate territories had the right to own enslaved people. 76. Stevens, the Confederate vice president, declared that, unlike the United States, the Confederacy was not based on the notion that all men were created. Instead, the cornerstone of the Confederacy, the foundation on which it was built, was the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. 77. White Southerners in the Confederacy, keeping enslavement was even more important than winning independence from the United States. The Confederacy lacked soldiers to fight in the later years of the Civil War. Confederate military leaders, including General Robert E. supported recruiting enslaved men as soldiers. The idea was that enslaved men would fight for the Confederacy in exchange for their freedom. 178. Recruiting enslaved men as soldiers and giving freedom to those who fought for the Confederacy was very unpopular because pro-slavery whites feared that it would weaken enslavement and go against the enslaving states' reason for seceding. 179. For example, Howell Cobb, a Confederate general from Georgia, said that giving guns to the enslaved was a suicidal policy, and he day you make soldiers of them as the beginning of the end of the revolution. 480. Since many white Southerners agreed with Cobb, the Confederacy did not accept the idea of freeing and arming enslaved men as soldiers until March 1865, the last month of the Civil War. The Confederacy organized a handful of enslaved men as soldiers in these very last days of the war, but none of them fought in battle. 81. The Confederacy, the Union made freeing the enslaved and recruiting enslaved men into the military a major part of its war strategy. Even though Abraham Lincoln and many Republican politicians were not interested in freeing the enslaved at first, the actions of enslaved people pushed the United States toward ending enslavement. 482. Enslaved people began escaping to U.S. military sites even before the war began. 183. When the United States Army began moving into the Confederacy, large numbers of refugees from enslavement, as many as 500,000 people or 12% of the entire enslaved population, sought freedom in U.S. Army camps. 484. These freedom seekers worked as wagon drivers, laundry workers, cooks, manual laborers, and nurses for the U.S. Army. 485. However, not all African Americans served in the Army voluntarily, as a small number were kidnapped and forced to enlist against their will. 486. Understood that these freedom seekers would play a key role in winning the war against the 75. 2. Enslavement. Every formerly enslaved person working for the U.S. took away resources from the South and helped the Union. 187. In 1861 and 1862, Congress passed laws called Confiscation Acts, which allowed the U.S. military to give shelter and work to enslaved people who were being forced to work for the Confederacy, and, later, to any enslaved person whose enslaver supported the Confederacy. 488. United States was dismantling enslavement. The Union could not immediately or completely abolish the institution. Of 11 southern states, the number of enslaving congressmen decreased accordingly, which did give opponents of enslavement an advantage. 489. However, more than 20% of the members of Congress during the Civil War remained either current or former slaveholders, mostly from the border states that had not seceded. 190. Lincoln was also slow to use his presidential power to free enslaved people. September 1862, Lincoln wrote a preliminary version of the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all the enslaved people in any area still in rebellion against the United States on the first day of the new year in 1863. 191 Lincoln's preliminary proclamation also recommended transporting newly freed African Americans out of the United States and resettling them elsewhere. 492, a scheme that Lincoln considered seriously for years until it was clear that most African Americans to leave the land of their birth. 493 Then, on January 1, 1863, Lincoln signed his final Emancipation Proclamation, setting enslaved people free everywhere in the Confederacy, except the parts already controlled by the U.S. Army. 494 and reference to removing African Americans overseas. 195 The Emancipation Proclamation also left out the enslaving border states that had not joined the Confederacy: Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, and Missouri, to keep them loyal to the Union. 496 Enslaved people tear down enslavement and fight for their freedom. Enslaved people set the Emancipation Proclamation in motion by seeking freedom by the thousands, and they also fought for their freedom on the battlefield. Stopped excluding black men from the U.S. Army in 1862-497, and the Emancipation Proclamation opened the way for black men to join the Army and Navy. 198 Free African Americans in Union states quickly organized military units, including the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. 499 Black Civil War soldiers were formerly enslaved men recruited in the South as part of the United States Colored Troops. CT. Altogether, 178,000 black men served in 175 U.S. CT regiments. Another 29,000 black men served in the U.S. Navy. 501 By the end of the Civil War, black servicemen made up roughly 10% of the entire Union military. They fought in every major Union military campaign between 1864 and 1865, 503, and participated in 39 major battles and 410 smaller armed conflicts. For around 40,000 of these men, around 20%, died during the Civil War. 505 7th U.S. Colored Infantry stand guard during the United States Civil War. 1860-1865 Corbus via Getty Images. United States was dismantling enslavement. The Union could not immediately or completely abolish the institution. More than 20% of the members of Congress during the Civil War remained either current or former enslavers, mostly from the border states that had not seceded. 76 2. Government and the U.S. military did not treat black soldiers equally. Soldiers faced doing hard labor, being fed less nutritious food than white soldiers, and having less access to medical care. 106 The federal government also paid black soldiers less than white soldiers, and black soldiers were closed out of opportunities to lead their units as high-ranking officers because these positions were given to white men only. 107 Black soldiers' resistance to poor treatment helped fix some of these inequalities. 8 After black soldiers protested strongly against lower pay, Congress finally began paying black and white soldiers equally in 1864. 109 By the end of the war, 80 black men also won their promotion to high-ranking officer positions. 510 For a further discussion the U.S. military's discriminatory treatment of African Americans, see Chapter 10, Stolen Labor and Hindered Opportunity. These black servicemen fought bravely to win their freedom and equal rights with white Americans. Satira A. Douglas, a black woman whose husband, H. Douglas, fought in the war, explained that black soldiers wanted to strike the blow that will at once relieve them of Northern prejudice and Southern slavery. 11 They fought courageously because they had everything to gain in this conflict: liberty, honor, social and political position, and losing the war would result in slavery. Prejudice of caste. 512 Instance, the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, the most famous Northern black unit, and the one in which Frederick Douglass's 2 sons served, led a heroic attack on Fort Wagner, South Carolina in July 1863. 513 More than 40% of the men died or were wounded in the attack. 514 One of the survivors of Fort Wagner, Sergeant William Harvey Carney, eventually was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military honor in the United States, for saving the 54th Massachusetts flag from the enemy. 15 Carney was among 26 black Civil War soldiers who earned this prestigious medal for bravery above and beyond the call of duty. 516. Soldiers also faced more violence on the battlefield than white soldiers. Confederacy threatened to kill or enslave black soldiers who Confederates captured as prisoners of war. 17. Abraham Lincoln tried to protect black soldiers by warning the Confederacy that the Union would kill or force into hard labor 1 Confederate prisoner of war for every black soldier that Confederates killed or enslaved. 518. Still, some Confederates targeted black servicemen with violence. In 1864, Confederates attacked a much smaller Union force of mostly black soldiers at Fort Pillow in Tennessee. The Confederates entered the fort and killed 300 men, 200 of whom were black. 519 witnesses said that Confederates killed these black soldiers instead of capturing them as prisoners of war. 520. After this massacre, it became popular for black soldiers to shout, "Remember Fort Pillow," as they went into battle to fight for their lives and their freedom. 21. Civil War and the 13th Amendment. States won the Civil War against the Confederacy in 1865, effectively ending enslavement in all of the ex-Confederate states. People in Texas, one of the very last places reached by the United States Army, did not hear that they had been legally freed until June 19, 1865. 122. This was 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Enslaved black Texans began celebrating June 19 as Juneteenth, a day to remember their hard-fought battle for freedom. 523. 6 months later, on December 6, 1865, the required number of states finally approved the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution outlawing enslavement and making emancipation permanent. 24. The amendment said that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. 525. Section 2 of the 13th. At the end of the Civil War, black servicemen made up roughly 10% of the entire Union military. Government and the U.S. military did not treat black soldiers equally. Soldiers faced doing hard labor, being fed less nutritious food than white soldiers, and having less access to medical care. The federal government also paid black soldiers less than white soldiers, and black soldiers were closed out of opportunities to lead their units as high-ranking officers because these positions were given to white men only. 7. Enslavement. The amendment also empowered Congress to pass appropriate legislation to enforce the elimination of enslavement. 526, which the U.S. Supreme Court later interpreted as the power to outlaw all badges and incidents of slavery. 27.